All right, guys, we're going to talk about the revolution in energy and industry from 1760 to about 1850. That's a pretty big time span we're going to talk about. But chapter 23, it covers the Industrial Revolution in Britain, and then the next section is about industrialization in Europe and the world. Then it moves into new patterns of working and living, then relations between capital and labor. So we're going to start off with the Industrial Revolution in Britain, because that's where it starts. There we go. So why Britain? Well, there's a unique set of factors. Britain had abundant coal, they had high wages, a centralized government, developed financial systems, innovative culture, skilled craftsmen, and a strong position in the global trade market. The scientific revolution and enlightenment fostered an embrace of research, experimentation, and knowledge sharing. A surplus of English woolen cloth, along with the empire, had produced a thriving export economy and relatively high wages for cloth workers. Also, a large labor force employed by agricultural changes and improvement was available for work in manufacturing companies and urban communities. And the industrial changes influenced migration from rural to the growing cities. Water canals were built to ship the merchandise to the consumer. The waterways provided easy transportation of raw materials such as iron and coal necessary for industrial production. And British parliamentary government taxed aggressively, invested in maritime security, and adopted aggressive protection tariffs to support the British industry. But just, you guys know I love my maps. Just to give you an idea of kind of what we just talked about coal. So the coal deposits around Newcastle and also here. Metal goods are here circled for you. Wool and cloth kind of all throughout the island, the nation. Canals, you can see that were built here in the green, and then also the navigable rivers like the Thames that runs through, London there. So here's some technological innovations in early factories. There was this old system of production called the putting out system. It involved a merchant contracting the skills of craftsmen to create the finished product. And so the merchant provided the raw materials for the craftsmen, who would then go to their home, assemble the finished product, put it together, and then give it back to the merchant in order for them to sell. The system was full of problems though. Not enough spinners were available to keep a weaver employed. Weights of materials or quality of cloth were other issues of contention, and it was also difficult to control the labor that was scattered throughout the countryside. So there's a gentleman by the name of James Hargreaves, and he invented the spinning jenny, which was a hand-powered, and it had 24 spindles mounted on a sliding carriage, and it made a slender thread. Richard Arkwright invented the spinning machine called the water frame, and this machine had close to 100 spindles and needed more power. A special mill had to be built along a waterway to capture the motion of a flowing stream, and the water frame could spin only a coarse thread that would be respun on the spinning jenny. So then we have Eli Whitney with the cotton gin, a machine for separating cotton fibers from seeds, vastly increased the productivity of cotton fields in the United States, leading to an expansion of slavery. We also have Hargreaves' spinning jenny and Arkwright's water frame were somewhat combined into this hybrid machine made by Samuel Crompton. The innovative machines and changes in the spinning of thread created a fast expansion in the textile industry, causing a transition from the putting out system to mass production in-house, in mills and in factories. Weavers became some of the best paid employees throughout England. A large number of unemployed agricultural workers became weavers, and then by 1831 the cotton textile industry accounted for 22% of Britain's industrial production, and British cotton textiles cost half as much as Indian ones. And just for you visual learners out there, this is a woman working a spinning jenny. So these, where the thread was spun, but you can see all of those they're lined out. And then of course she's working, spinning the wheel, and then they're spinning it onto this smaller piece here. So kind of cool. So steam power and the energy revolution. So although the Industrial Revolution was creating new innovative ways of mass production, many other places throughout the world were still using wood for fuel and humans or animals doing most of the labor. Wood was a basic fuel for heat in both homes and industries. Charcoal, a processed wood, was mixed with iron ore in a blast furnace to produce pig iron. The growing demand for wood and the shrinking supply of it was beginning to threaten industrial productivity. So they're going to look for a new source, right? So that's where coal became a source of fuel that alleviated the concerns of the short supply of wood. Coal had been used as a source of fuel for heat in the Middle Ages, and during the Industrial Revolution, coal became a source of energy that powered machinery. Coal mines, constantly filled with water that had to be pumped out so mining operations could continue. Pumps were powered by animals walking in circles. But Thomas Avery and Thomas Newcomen, they developed the first prototype steam engine that burned coal to produce a flow of steam that powered the water pump. Improvements on the steam engine began and opened a vast array of industrial opportunities, and steam-powered drained mines powered factories and replaced water power in flour and malt mills. Iron workers began to use coke, a smokeless and hot-burning fuel produced by heating coal to rid it of water and impurities during the process of smelting iron. And then by the mid-1800s, Great Britain was producing close to 3 million tons of iron, which helped lower its price and make it an inexpensive economic building block. This is a replica of a spinning mule. And then here is a depiction of the mighty steam hammer. Look how many guys it takes to put this through, though, right? They don't have like the heavy machinery that can push that through. So lots of guys working on one end. And then also look over here to spin it. And then you got these two guys that are going to be there to like guide it through, also fan it if it needs to. Supervising. This is the job I think I would want. So the coal industry used plank roads to move wagons, hauling underground coal up to the surface, and rails reduced the friction and allowed a horse or a human to pull a heavier load. And rails could support a locomotive, and a wide variety of steam engines on rails were created because of that. The steam engine evolved into a locomotive that provided more transportation opportunities. The locomotive Rocket ran between Liverpool and Manchester at a quick pace of 16 miles per hour. The new industry of the railroad had tremendous ramifications for both industry and society. Markets grew larger because shipping times were significantly reduced. Larger markets encouraged the development of larger factories, and the railroad increased the power and speed of the entire society. Commodities and passengers could now travel to faraway locations in a reasonable amount of time. Just to give you an idea of how much, track mileage there was, India had about 16,000 miles. Great Britain India about 17,000, Great Britain not much more, Russia about 19,000, France 20, Germany 26, and then the United States. So one thing that you may not know about the United States, between like 1870, beginning in 1870, we had 50,000 miles of track, and then by 1890, we had over 200,000 miles of track. You also have to think of like how big the United States is, like just in square mileage. Like we're pretty large compared to, Germany and France and Great Britain. Not really Russia, but kind of makes sense that we would have a lot more because we have to cover a lot more ground. Industrial fairs and exhibitions showcase the fast-paced industrial innovations. Let me just start that one over. Industrial fairs and exhibitions showcase the fast-paced industrial innovations. The Great Exhibition in London shone a spotlight on the Crystal Palace, which was completely made of glass and iron. I have a picture for you. It's so pretty. The British gross national product increased at a phenomenal pace between the late 1700s and the mid-1800s, and social philosophers began to wring their hands and concerned about the impact that industrialization would have on the people. And Thomas Malthus, he posited that the population increases would lead to starvation and put privations on the lower class. And he called for restraint and procreation within the population. And he's actually right. I mean, we are going to see, poverty will become a huge problem throughout every nation. With more and more people, standard of living is rising, so the population is also growing, but then there's not enough place, there's not enough work, there's not enough products for everyone. Here's a picture of the glass palace for you. Crystal Palace. Okay, let's talk about industrialization in Europe and the world now. So moving beyond just Great Britain. So British industry was superior in industrial development on the continent of Europe. Other European nations had been smashed by earlier wars. France had its devastating revolution, only to be followed by the Napoleonic era that wrought havoc on the rest of Europe. Great Britain was able to avoid that destruction, though, and that's kind of another reason why they were able to really take off first. British goods had dominated the world markets, and British technology had become so advanced that few outside of Great Britain understood how it worked. Continental European nations began to copy the British industrialization and start their own industrialization. So Great Britain made it illegal for industrialists to leave the country and export like machinery and even blueprints. That was forbidden. Yet talented workers and industrialists were able to leave undetected, and they began to share their knowledge with industrialists in other nations. That's kind of how we also set up some of our mills, as British citizens like smuggled out blueprints and what they could remember and brought it to the States. But William Cockerell began building cotton spinning equipment in Belgium, and then his son John began a large industrial enterprise producing machinery, steam engines, and locomotives. We also have Fritz Harcourt. He started the industrialization of the Ruhr Valley in Germany. He turned to England for experienced mechanics. He also had to import expensive thick boilers from England. France was flooded with cheaper and better goods from Britain, and the French government responded with tariffs on British goods. The tariffs were taxes levied to raise the price to the same level as domestically produced goods. The Prussian government provided a guarantee that the state treasury would pay interest and principal on railroad bonds if they could regulate the private companies, and this provided the government with a greater role in industrialization. Economic nationalism was designed to protect and develop the national economy, but it also eroded the individual opportunity of the industrialist. Then banks also became major players in the financial end of the industrialization. Initially, banks found industrial ventures to be too risky for their capital, but this changed when banks received permission to become corporations enjoying limited liability, which helped banks to attract more investors. But let's talk about the global picture. So Egypt began to use imported British technology and began a modernization program, but they could not compete with lower priced European imports. Latin American countries were too busy with their independence movement to develop industrial economies. And then also India tried to develop industrial manufacturing but could not compete with the low-cost imported products from Europe. But now that we have the Industrial Revolution taking off, what was it like to actually work inside of those factories? So the first factories were cotton mills that ran on water power. They had to be located next to a fast-moving stream or river and were often located in, like sparsely populated areas. Employees had to keep up with the machine and develop a relentless rhythm. Employees had to be on time, work long hours, and were under constant supervision. Factories resembled poorhouses where destitute people lived. Employees often came to the work site with their families. The entire family had worked on the farm as a unit, so now the entire family would work in the mine or in the factory as a unit. Each member of the family would have a specific chore to do for the company. Arguments for improved standards in the workplace grew. Injuries were always a concern, especially those involving children. The Factory Act of 1833 limited the hours children over the age of 9 could work. Children under 9 had to be enrolled in schools run by the factory, and this led to a decline in child employment. Many employees in Great Britain were from Ireland. The Irish economy was deteriorating and people were in need of work. So they worked together, formed their own neighborhoods, and began to thrive. The Mine Act of 1842 prohibited underground work for all women and girls, as well as boys under the age of 10. There's also a sexual division of labor. And so pre-industrial labor was assigned in family units, right? And certain jobs were assigned by gender. Industrial employment had the man as the primary wage earner, while the woman had only limited job opportunities. Women were expected to focus on the domestic needs of raising children, housework, and other craft work that could be done at home. These labor divisions developed into separate spheres of expectations based on gender. Factory work conflicted with childcare. So pregnant women, they also could not keep up with the pace or feed infants. Women who worked at a factory would then come home to confront a full-time domestic job, including all the shopping, the cooking, and the cleaning. Unmarried women who worked for wages outside of the home were segregated to certain jobs. Modest gains in factory wages after 1815 were offset by declining participation of women and children in producing household income. So although you're getting more money, more and more women and children are staying home and not working outside of the home anymore. So overall, hours of work and harshness of work conditions increased between 1760 and 1830. As factories moved to urban areas became overcrowded, hastily constructed, and increasingly unsanitary. Rising food prices also undercut increases in wages. So then after 1850, price decreases and greater access to a variety of food led to increases in the standard of living for the working class, which that's a good thing. You want more access to better food. But disruption of community in the new urban setting, as well as loss of skills and work autonomy in the new factory setting, were less tangible factors in the sense of working class living conditions. And also there was an impact on, the environment. By the mid-17th century, coal had replaced wood as the major fuel for domestic usage. Coal was also used for industrial purposes, and smoke pervaded large cities like London. Burning coal released soot and toxic particles into the atmosphere. This began to cause acid rain. Sewage systems did not become widespread until the mid-19th century, and rapidly expanding industrial cities lacked clean water means for disposing of excrement and garbage. Most waste was just dumped into rivers, causing further environmental damage. In the 1880s, reformers demanded air pollution laws, but they faced resistance from many factory owners and employees fearful of losing their jobs and this laissez-faire or hands-off style of government. And we have a new class of factory owners that's going to emerge. So early industrialists of moderate means employed their families and friends, and some were members of well-established families, which were rich with contacts and support. It became more difficult for entrepreneurs to get started as factories grew larger, and by the 1860s, the industrialists had inherited strong established businesses from parents who had been the entrepreneurs. The women of successful business families have fewer opportunities for participation in the family business, and their role was as the proper wife and mother who maintained the elegant home. So critics were really worried about the destruction of the rural way of life and pollution of land and water. Poets wrote about the satanic mills and sympathized with the worker who faced a hard life and poverty. You also have Luddites. Those are handicraft workers who resented machines they felt were replacing man, and so they attacked factories and destroyed private property. Frederick Engels and Karl Marx blamed industrial capitalism and its competition for much of the social ills, like poverty, like pollution, that kind of stuff. And class consciousness developed, which according to Marx meant that conflicting classes existed, in part because many individuals came to believe they existed and developed an awareness that they belonged to a particular social class. Social classes, if you're not aware, you have your elite wealthy class, you have your middle class, and then you have your lower class. Those are kind of the different social classes that we have here in the United States. Most like Western developing countries, like in Europe, kind of along those same lines. Small workshops that crafted specific product provided an alternative to large factory employment. Working class solidarity developed in both large factories and small workshops, and British Parliament passed the Combination Acts that made unions and strikes illegal. The craft guilds resented the laws, which are later on they're gonna be repealed. Labor movements moved toward trade unions, and some unions won benefits for members and became a part of the industrial environment. Many people were attracted to the Chartist movement, which sought universal suffrage for men and a 10-hour workday. And then also we do have the impact of slavery, and slave labor was still used in colonial holdings of European states. The slave trade led to development of finance and credit institutions and helping industrialists with capital for their business. Great Britain freed their slaves in their territories in 1807, but they still depended on the cotton produced in the United States by U.S. slave labor, which, as we know, does not end until 1865. So as we move into chapter 24, just kind of keep in mind all this that we've learned about the Industrial Revolution, because now we're going to look at like shifting ideologies that are going to change and embracing like nationalism and socialism. That's what we're going to talk about in chapter 24.